Good morning. I welcome you to our weekly Bible study. I'm Chaplain Harold Epley, and it's good to be with you again this week, virtually, as we continue with our study of the Scriptures. Again, I have to say how much I miss all of you, miss seeing your faces and having our face-to-face Bible studies where we have such wonderful conversations. But for now, this is the best we can do. And I do hope you, if you have a Bible in your apartment or somewhere nearby, that you will be able to have that and follow along as I read to you from the Scriptures. And then we will be doing another devotion again today from the book Dancing in the Aisle, Spiritual Lessons We Have Learned from Children, which is a book that my wife Rochelle Melander and I wrote a number of years ago. It contains Bible studies that are based on stories that we collected over the years about things that children did and some of the lessons that we can learn from them and how they apply to our own spiritual lives as adults. And today we have a very interesting one. It's the chapter is entitled Temper Tantrum. And if you've been around kids much, you know that temper tantrums can be a common part, especially among younger children, common part of their daily experience, especially children who haven't quite gotten old enough yet to learn how to express their anger. But that is part of a broader theme that we'll be looking at today, which is anger in general, and how we as spiritual people express our anger, because sometimes that's something we tend to stifle our feelings of when we're upset about things, and sometimes we have some trouble really expressing anger in ways that are appropriate. Either we don't say anything at all when we're feeling angry, or we end up blowing up about something. And so we're going to look at that because anger is definitely a part of our life, and it's something that can't always be avoided, but there are obviously appropriate and inappropriate ways to express anger. And so for our Bible passage, we're going to start by actually looking at Jesus and some of the ways that he expressed his anger, which is something that we don't often think about when, we talk about Jesus being the Prince of Peace, and usually when you come to church, the lessons we hear are focused more on Jesus teaching and being very calm and being a very peaceful presence in front of people. But there are a few scripture passages where we see this very human side of Jesus, where he gets upset about some things and expresses his anger, which is a reminder to us that that's part of being human. And so the passage that we're going to look at, especially today, is from Mark, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 11. And I'm going to read a rather lengthy passage from verses 12 through 25. And so if you have your Bible and you want to follow along, I'm going to be reading, as I usually do, from the New Revised Standard Version. On the following day, when they came from Bethany, and they here means Jesus and his disciples, he, meaning Jesus, was hungry. Seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see whether perhaps he would find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. He said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it. Then they came to Jerusalem. And he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling and those who were buying in the temple. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. And he would not allow anyone to carry anything through the temple. He was teaching and saying, "It is not written, 'My house shall be called a house of prayer for all the nations.' But you have made it a den of robbers." And then the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and they kept looking for a way to kill him, for they were afraid of him, because the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. And when evening came, Jesus and his disciples went out of the city. In the morning, as they passed by, they saw the fig tree withered away to its roots. Then Peter remembered and said to Jesus, "Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed has withered." Jesus answered them, "Have faith in God. Truly I tell you, if you say to this mountain, 'Be taken up and thrown into the sea,' and if you do not doubt in your heart, but believe that what you say will come to pass, it will be done for you. So I tell you, whatever you ask for in prayer, believe that you have received it, and it will be yours. Whenever you stand praying, forgive, if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father in heaven may also forgive you your trespasses." Okay, as I said, rather lengthy passage there, but we see at least a couple of encounters where Jesus is expressing some anger. First, this anger at the fig tree, and then, which seems almost kind of irrational on the part of Jesus, but again shows his very human side of feeling frustrated. And then the bigger story where he goes into the temple and casts out the money changers, and that's a story that maybe you've heard that preached on in church before, but that's a scene where Jesus is just moved by his passion for righteousness and just, I guess the phrase that comes to my mind there is righteous anger that he's feeling. And there are indeed times when we see injustices in this world and things that aren't fair or right, or injustices that happen to ourselves, when we feel that kind of righteous anger. But we're going to look at anger more broadly, and we're going to start now with this meditation called Temper Tantrum, the story of this little girl named Hannah who gets really quite angry at her parents. It has been an enjoyable evening of game playing and conversation. Perhaps too enjoyable. For now that bedtime has arrived, Hannah doesn't want the evening to end. "No! Let me stay up!" she shouts, when her father tells her to change into her pajamas. Hannah's father calmly explains that playtime is now over and that 4-year-olds need to go to bed at an earlier hour than adults. "No!" Hannah wails as her mother takes her by the hand and guides her toward the bathroom. Suddenly, Hannah breaks free of her mother's grasp and plunges face down onto the floor, shrieking and flailing as if she has been thrown into a vat of boiling water. "You hate me!" she shouts in a fit of heartfelt overacting. When her father responds by stating that no, her parents do not hate her, Hannah changes her approach. "Well, I hate you," she howls, now doing her best imitation of a demon-possessed maniac who has lost all control of her senses. Of course, the child is not possessed by demons, and she doesn't really hate her parents. And she knows they don't hate her. She is exhausted and frustrated. That's all. Hannah's parents carry her to bed, kicking and screaming. They help her say her prayers, give her a goodnight hug, and then leave her to sob herself to sleep. In the morning, she'll wake, refreshed and cheerful, her bedtime temper tantrum a distant memory. It's a familiar event for anybody who's been around children. In the preschool years, when most children have not yet learned the inhibitions that restrain them from openly expressing their anger, temper tantrums are especially common. Many times, these public displays of rage are the result of pure frustration. Other times, they are tests to see how much the child can get away with. Few adults would want to emulate Hannah's fit of rage. Most of us are aware of the hazards of expressing anger inappropriately. Yet Hannah's temper tantrums can teach us something about what it means to live in a trusting relationship. Hannah feels free to express her anger because she knows that her parents love her. She feels loved enough to scream the things she fears the most, that her parents really do hate her, that they secretly wish she had never been born. When we can utter those words, it usually means we trust that others will continue to love us in spite of what we might say or think or do. It means that our relationship with them is strong enough to survive an occasional bout of anger or doubt or fear. We all get angry from time to time. We've all had people get angry with us. Unfortunately, in many popular religious circles, Christians are encouraged to stifle all anger. Jesus is remembered as the passive and mild-mannered child of God who never so much as raised his voice. Yet when we turn to the Scriptures, we see that Jesus sometimes expressed feelings that we may try to suppress, including anger and doubt. Just after Jesus' triumphant entry into Jerusalem, he cursed the fig tree. While confronting people who were using the temple grounds to make money, Jesus became ferociously angry, overturning tables and pouring out the coins of the money changers in a sort of temple tantrum. In the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus did not hesitate to express his real feelings. He told God exactly how he felt and even asked to have the cup removed from his hands. Jesus did not act the part of the ever-cheerful child of God with a plastic smile plastered on his face. Jesus was truly human, fully experiencing and expressing pain, anger, and doubt. As such, Jesus is a role model for us in our relationship with God. Many of us would prefer that God see only our good side, the side that we show to acquaintances and distant relatives who occasionally drop in for a visit. We want God to come into our lives when the house is clean, the children are well behaved, and we're all dressed in our Sunday best. We want God to see us acting kindly toward others, reading our Bibles, and remembering to tithe. And so when we feel angry and disenchanted and frustrated, we take it out on ourselves, our families, our friends, sometimes even strangers. We don't include God in our tirades. And yet God, who loves us like a perfect parent, with an unconditional, forgiving love, can certainly handle our anger. God knows us through and through, and even so, will never desert us. We can trust this love. Indeed, we can trust God even more than we can trust ourselves. God wants us to trust enough to say what we feel at all times. God, who loves us without restraint, wants us to be secure enough in this love to invite God to be a participant in all of our life, the better and the worse. Okay, that's the devotion. So some food for thought there about anger, and especially at the end of the devotion there, talking about expressing our anger to God. And, like we say in the devotion, sometimes we only want God to see our good side. But the reality is, God sees all of us all the time anyways. We can't hide things from God. If we're thinking nasty thoughts, God knows that, right? It seems sort of foolish to think that we should only show God our good side. And so, one of the things that we do actually in the challenge here is challenge you to think about how can you express your anger to God in those times when you feel angry, or you feel upset, or you have doubts, or you worry about things, or you're anxious about things. What we consider the negative emotions. And really reminding people that it's okay to show God that side of yourself. And actually, there are a number of Psalms, and if you want to do this later, you can look up some of the Psalms. Some specific ones are number 13, 22, and 35. Those are all Psalms. They're called precatory Psalms. And in them, they're sometimes also called Psalms of complaint. And in them, the writer of the Psalm sort of waves their fist at God and expresses some anger or fear, some of those what we call negative emotions. And they're interesting because you can kind of use them as a model for prayer in those times when you might be feeling upset about something. What's interesting about the Psalms is even though the writer expresses being upset with God at times, they always sort of come around in the end and recognize the fact that even though life doesn't always go the way we want it to, God has indeed blessed us greatly, and that God is always our advocate. God always loves us unconditionally with a forgiving kind of love. And so those are helpful to look at some of those when you might be feeling upset about anything, really. So here's some questions for reflection or discussion. The first one is, in what ways do you express your anger? Think about that. Are you one of those people who tends to stuff your anger, keep it in, don't say anything? Or maybe you grew up in a family where everybody was just spilled it all out, got it all out there. I have some friends who are like that, and I grew up in a family where we kind of kept everything to ourselves. But it's an interesting thing to think about because we all have different ways of expressing anger, and sometimes the different ways can lead to some conflicts with those we love. So that's a question to think about. The second question is, what do you consider to be inappropriate and appropriate ways of expressing anger? And that's a serious question to consider because there are obviously ways that can be very hurtful. And Hannah in this story was quite hurtful to her parents. Fortunately, she had some loving parents who understood that when she's shouting, I hate you, that she didn't really mean that. And they were able to see that was just sort of in the moment for her, that she was feeling that. But as adults, we can get ourselves into a lot of trouble by inappropriately expressing anger. So sometimes it is good to take a deep breath and think a minute before we actually say something. And yet at the same time, it's not good to stuff our anger either, right? And remember the model of Jesus. There are appropriate times to be angry. Jesus felt great passion when he expressed anger at the money changers in the temple. And there are things in the world that are wrong that it is appropriate to be angry about. There are injustices and great horrible things that happen that were we not angry about them, I think you have to wonder why are we so indifferent about it. So there are times, things to be angry about. But the question then is, how do we express that anger in a way that is helpful, that is beneficial to others, and that can lead to some change in a way that is creative and productive. Third question here, recall a time when you felt angry with God. How did you express that anger? Maybe you say, I never get angry with God. Well, I think we all do, because there's a lot of things in this world that aren't right, and sometimes we think, well, God, you're in charge. Why are you allowing this to happen? I think if we're honest that we do have those moments where even if we're not angry with God, we've got some doubts. We're wondering how these things can be. And if you're not feeling those things from time to time, then maybe you're not really considering the state of the world, because things aren't always good. And certainly in these times, we know that there are many people suffering and hurting. And I think the thing with God is, God has heard these questions before. Many people have waved their fists at God and said, why? Why are you allowing this to happen? And God can take it. God can take your questions. And God will keep loving you. I like to use that image sometimes of when my son was really young, and he would get really upset about something, and he'd have maybe one of those sort of temper tantrums. I would just grab him in my arms and give him a big hug and hold him tight until he'd stop being upset. And I think that's, when you express your anger to God, that's what God does to you. God grabs you in his arms and holds you tight and says, I'm not going to let you go because I love you so much. So, some things to think about there with expressing anger and some of those other emotions that we sometimes call negative emotions, but really aren't. They're just part of being human. So it's been fun being with you again today, and I hope you continue to study the Scriptures on your own, and look forward to that day when we can get together again and have our wonderful conversations. So God bless you. Have a great week. Take care. We'll see you again soon.